So, um, can everybody can see pretty well? I'm really happy that Ellen is able to join us today. There she is. Wait, can we see your dogs? Oops, you're muted, I think. Oh, there they are.
So I have two lab mixes. This is Ellie, and that is Bella.
Yeah.
And we are hiding in an upstairs bedroom in my house because we're having some work done, and it's the only place that's quiet. So
Yeah.
I apologize that I'm like literally sitting on a bed for
That's okay.
meeting.
That's okay. We like our animal companions. But Ellen has been the executive director or NC area director for Church World Services since when, Ellen?
I've worked for CWS since 2009, and I took over as the office director in Durham in 2014.
2014, which has been one of the most active periods of time in refugee work in general, refugee resettlement in particular. And so I asked Ellen to come in because I think this is one area, especially for students who are interested in doing human rights work. The whole area of refugees and refugee resettlement is something people don't necessarily think about right away, but it's hugely important. And it's also a way that many people can do refugee work, not in Washington and New York, but in places like Durham, places like Louisville, places like Chicago, places like San Francisco, because there are refugee resettlement entities all over the country. But refugee resettlement also has, particular challenges, politics that Ellen's going to talk about. So I'm going to hand it over to Ellen. And Ellen, just I don't know if you're going to be able to see the advanced thing on the PowerPoint, but we haven't done this before like this. So just give me a shout if you need it to be advanced. But thank you so much for coming.
Great, thanks, Robin. Really happy to be here. I've been doing this yearly, speaking to Robin's class yearly since like 2016 or 2017. And it's by far one of my favorite groups to talk to. So really appreciate you guys also being here and giving me your attention for an hour today. I'll work through the presentation. It's chock full of information, and you all will have the PowerPoint. I believe Robin will share the PowerPoint with you after this. So there's a little bit of information that I may kind of gloss over because I want to make sure we have time to get through the whole thing. It is fine with me. I'd actually love it if you ask questions as we go. And if it's a question that will be answered later, or a question that's a little bit off topic or something by accident, I will also hang out for a few minutes at the end, and I'd be happy to answer it individually. Let me see if I can. Robin, I'm not sure if I can advance. Yeah, I may have to rely on you.
Yeah.
All right, next slide. So really quickly, I just want to kind of make sure we're all working with the same definitions of refugees. So when we think about refugees for the purposes of refugee resettlement, we are thinking about people who meet this specific UNHCR definition. And that also means that they, not only that they meet this definition and function, but that they have actually been vetted for meeting this definition. That is required of folks who are resettling to the United States under the Refugee Resettlement Program. There are lots of other groups of vulnerable immigrants, and we will definitely talk about those people. I promise I won't leave them out. But when we talk about refugees specific to the Refugee Resettlement Program, we're talking about people who meet this definition. Next slide. UNHCR, it's the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is the organization that takes the lead on protecting refugees. So basically, if you're a refugee, you can't avail yourself to the protection of your home country's government. and UNHCR is the organization that picks up for the protections of those people worldwide. Next slide. So this is getting into what I mentioned earlier with sort of starting to rethink the way we define refugees. And with the state of global migration currently, there are a lot of folks who are forced to flee their homes around the world who don't exactly fit into that definition that I gave earlier, who are still highly vulnerable, still unable to avail themselves to the protection of their home government, and still require that global entities are working in collaboration to identify durable solutions for their protection. Next slide. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint and you'll have the graphic. So I won't go through all of it. What I do want to point out to you is that at this moment, and this statistic is even a little bit old, it's the most current one available through UNHCR, but almost 80 million people displaced at the end of 2019. And if you can go to the next slide. I just want to point out the trend here. Like, we are globally really going in the wrong direction. So we're almost double the number of people who were forcibly displaced in 2010. And, I included this statistic from the UNHCR Global Trends report that in 2018, 25 people were forced to flee their homes every single minute. Those numbers are really astonishing. And, when we think about refugees and migration issues, we really have to think about them as global issues that require collaborative efforts from major countries, including the US, to come up with solutions. They're not problems that live solely in the country where the problem exists, right? They affect all of the surrounding countries, and these issues are happening in continents across the globe. So really, we're kind of all in it together. Next slide. Major countries of origin for refugees: Syria, South Sudan, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see Ethiopia, Iraq, Burma, Rwanda, Somalia. These are all countries that have long-standing populations of refugees. Many of them, there are large populations of refugees living in camps who haven't lived in their home country for 20 years. There are also countries where there tends to be sort of a rise and fall of new refugees. So if you've been paying attention to what's going on in Myanmar right now and what's been happening there over the last few years, while in some aspects the political situation there has been getting a little bit better, there have been other periods of time where it was getting dramatically worse very quickly for Rohingya people. And so even while the situation maybe for the country at large was getting a little bit better, there were still massive numbers of Rohingya people fleeing Myanmar as refugees. Large percentages of newly displaced people, so people who have been displaced in the last couple of years, coming from Venezuela, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico. Next slide. So when we think about refugees, I think it's really difficult to understand the people that you're talking about without understanding a little bit of how they got to where they are now. Everyone's situation is a little bit different. It depends on where you came from and what happened there. But the thing that everyone has in common is that they are folks who were forced to make an incredibly desperate decision to save their lives, to leave their homes and most of their possessions behind and go somewhere else for safety. Sometimes you have folks who have been watching a situation get worse and worse for years, and you know, suddenly it just becomes obvious that they probably need to leave while they wait to see what happens. And other times, you know, people live in a village that gets attacked and they literally just run. They don't take anything with them when they woke up that morning, or you know, maybe they went to work that day, or they went to collect water that day. They had no idea that this was going to happen to them, and they are literally leaving with the clothes on their backs and whoever was with them at the time. One of the things that we see out of situations like that is a lot of family separation. So you can imagine that, you know, there are women who are working together to watch one another's children while they're going about their daily tasks. And there are untold situations where, you know, one family ends up with several children that were left in their care just for a few hours, who are now living with them in a refugee camp because they fled the village with these kids in tow. And on the other hand, that kid's actual parent may or may not have even survived. They may or may not have any idea that their children survived. And even if they believe that, you know, are hopeful that everyone's alive, they could be in completely different, you know, in completely different countries. That would be unusual coming out of the same village, but we've certainly seen that happen in situations where, like, someone's kids were in a boarding school an hour away. People decide who and what to take. So one thing that sometimes keeps, you know, families waiting to leave for, you know, a long enough period of time that it ultimately compromises their safety are elderly family members or small children that they believe might not make the journey. Also, you know, how you're traveling, whether you're going by foot or if you have the means and opportunity to get on a plane, will also affect, you know, who goes with you and where you go and what you take with you. And obviously, how you travel also influences whether it's days or weeks. You know, we know a lot of refugees who walk through really hostile terrain on foot for weeks, sometimes even months, to get to safety. Next slide. I won't read all of these things to you, but I would encourage you to check out this exhibit. It's available online, and you can go to the next slide too. It is a feature of refugees with their most important thing. So the most important thing they brought with them. And I love it. It's a humbling and really insightful look into how people experience gratitude and your possessions, and what becomes important to you when, you know, we're sort of most stripped down to our most vulnerable moment. Next slide. When a refugee reaches a neighboring country, and again, to meet the UNHCR definition of refugee, you have to be outside of your country of origin. So there are huge numbers of people who never make it to a different country, but when we're thinking about refugees who end up resettling through the refugee resettlement program, this is the group of folks we're talking about. They find a UNHCR office with which to register. So, you know, sometimes it's in a refugee camp, sometimes it's if someone flees to an urban area, it might just be an office in the middle of the city. They explain their persecution story, and UNHCR officers will make determinations as to whether or not the person actually qualifies for refugee status. Those officers have a lot of background knowledge on the conflict situations that people are fleeing, and they are able to sort of root out any claims that don't quite add up, or sort of table them for further investigation. And then ultimately, refugees are attempting to build a life founded on total uncertainty. So most people who leave their country genuinely believe that they'll be able to go back soon. they might think that it will be 3 months or 6 months or a year, but most people don't realize until they've been gone for several years that there's a good chance they're never going home, or that it may be years or even decades. And you know, when people are building new lives, they're thinking about what strengths do we have, what are the opportunities for us here. You know, did they bring, you know, if they are a person who makes shoes, were they able to bring with them some of the materials and tools they need to possibly set up a little shop in a refugee camp or in the city they're living in to help support themselves? It's also a lesson in how incredibly resourceful people are. If you look at some of the huge refugee camps that were started as, you know, completely temporary facilities, you see kind of a bustling camp life where, you know, there are people who are making clothes and doing some minimal farming if they're able to get their hands on a little land, or selling things that they've made. I don't mean to make it sound like there's a bustling economy there, because they're not. But people are incredibly resourceful, and it's a really impressive lesson in human agency. You can go to the next slide. When UNHCR thinks about large-scale forced displacement, meaning lots of people fleeing, right, like the situation in Syria, they have sort of three top solutions that they're looking at. So one is, can the situation be resolved so all of these people can return home safely? That's the ideal solution. Historically, it's been the solution that UNHCR was really going for with most refugees. I will tell you that right now, at this moment in history, that's not really, there are so many refugees worldwide that it's not that UNHCR has abandoned that idea that people will be able to go home, but it's certainly sort of being tabled to look at options number 2 and number 3. So number 2 is, can these refugees be integrated into the country where they're living now, what we call a host country? That option has traditionally been available for small numbers of refugees because host countries are very hesitant to do things that would make it appealing for more refugees to go there. And, you know, you only have to look at the US policies over the last few years to, you know, refugees fleeing to our southern border, right, to see, I'm not saying those were good policies, so everyone's clear, but to see that is really an attitude that lots of countries have, is that they're concerned about, you know, if integration friendly policies encourage more people to come, can we still support that number of vulnerable people? And then third country resettlement has largely been deemed as kind of the least appealing or least feasible option. So that involves refugees who are in you know, host countries being resettled to a different country like the US, Australia, Germany, or a number of other countries that have resettlement programs of some size. Canada is another one. Next slide. If you are referred for resettlement, you go through a very complicated and long application process. I will not read through every single one of these things, but because you all will have them. It takes on average about 2.5 years, and it often takes more like 10 years to go through all of the steps that are required to get someone admitted to the US or another third country as a refugee. It involves a host of different interviews, security checks, collection of biographic data, including like your fingerprints. And the last step is that you would fly to your new home. And when you come to the US, you enter as a fully documented and completely work authorized immigrant. And resettlement agency staff like us meet that person at the airport to help them get settled in. Next slide. This idea will,
Ellen,
we
can
will
I
come,
just,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry, this is Robin here. I just wanted to know if you could tell that story. We had a press conference, actually it was in front of Smith Warehouse with David Price. Remember that? I think that was 2017.
Yeah,
And you had one of the refugee women who was settled in Durham speak about having had to leave her newborn. Could you, I just find that story so moving about why she would leave an infant behind. If you just tell like, what was the circumstance around that?
yeah, absolutely. And if you want to go back to the previous slide, just so people are thinking about that, you know, when it's a particular story, but it's not uncommon. When people are going through the process of being resettled as a refugee, all of these, like the next step, right, always involves clearing the step before you. If you get married or you have a baby, you have to essentially start the resettlement process over with that person included as part of your refugee case. And so, you know, when you think about someone, like if this process took a year, right, people would probably just put off getting married or having a baby if they have the ability to make that decision for themselves. But when you think about it taking 5 years or 10 years and it's kind of an ambiguous timeline, it becomes a lot less realistic to do that. And what you see often is that people, rather than adding, so this woman that Robin's speaking of was a client of ours who'd had a baby at a very late point in her like stages of refugee processing. So she was very close to being able to come to the US. And her life was in danger where she was. She was not safe there. Her baby was safe, but because of some of the political activity that she and her husband had engaged in, they were not safe. And they were faced with this heartbreaking decision to either add their baby to their refugee case, knowing that they would essentially trigger the whole screening process to start over, which would likely result in at least a 18-month to 2-year delay on being able to get resettled, in which time it was a very real and not unlikely possibility that one or both of them could be murdered. Or they could choose to travel to the US as a family of, you know, I believe this family, it was just 2 people, although I will say I cannot clearly remember if they had a child before this baby, but basically they could choose to resettle as a family of 2, leave their baby with grandparents, and then apply for the baby to join them in the US. Our immigration systems have typically, for many, many years until the Trump administration, I mean, really since their inception, have recognized that this was a reality for certain categories of vulnerable immigrants, especially refugees. And we have had a lot of special provisions in place to expedite the needed to join their family here in the US. And so when the parents made the decision to leave the baby behind, when the mom made this decision, she believed with good reason that her baby would be able to get here to join her within maybe a year, possibly even less, because we would have traditionally considered a case like that to be extremely vulnerable. The Trump administration essentially blew up all of the avenues for that type of humanitarian family reunification. I will get into that a little bit more later. And so this woman had been waiting for her baby to join them, and there was no end or resolution in sight, because all of the systems that would have supported that baby's eventual arrival in the US were just sort of blown to pieces. And when we, kind of get into some of a little later on, Robin, I'm glad you reminded me about that story. Some of the, damage that the last administration did to our immigration system, and particularly humanitarian immigration. I hope that you'll keep that example in mind, because as I said before, it's really heartbreaking, but it's actually not particularly unusual. We have a lot of very similar cases that are working with our office to be reunited with their families. They're not all small babies, but there are a number of small children or even teenagers who've been separated from their family or their parents for, 5, 6, 8, 10 years. Thanks, Robin. Next slide. I want you to remember this. It will sort of become important as we keep talking later. Traditionally, the foundation of the refugee resettlement program is based on a bootstraps philosophy, right? We will allow refugees to come into our country, they will get jobs immediately, and they will support themselves and their families. It sounds great. I think this year in particular, this past year, there's been a lot of sort of public debunking of the myth of, America being a true bootstraps country. And we do find a lot of tension in our work between this, the ideological foundation of the program and then the practicalities of doing the work every day and the people that we are trying to serve. So hold this thought as we move through, because I hope it will be useful for you. Next slide. The resettlement program, what we think of as the federally funded refugee resettlement program, contracts with local agencies like CWS to provide initial support services for refugees. And then the idea is that we would get them connected to existing community support so that we're not recreating the wheel, but rather acting as a bridge for refugees who need to enroll in school, healthcare, get jobs, might need additional supportive services for like a disability or something like that. So we're not necessarily supposed to provide them, but rather to connect them to services that already exist. The resettlement program has a pretty long list of what they call core services that they want refugee resettlement agencies to be doing. Or when I say want, what I actually mean is contractually mandated to do them. And those things are things like helping someone get a social security card, making sure they have housing, helping kids get enrolled in school, that kind of thing. We also have longer term services that are focused on healthcare case management, English language training, and employment services, as well as immigration legal services. And Robin, you can go to the next slide. Sorry. Can you go back one slide? Thank you. One thing I just want to flag for you is that the initial resettlement period is considered to be 90 days. And so when we think about the really intensive support that CWS provides, it's in many ways, it's not limited, but it's really focused on someone's first 90 days. We operate on a declining model of support. So the idea is that as a refugee gets more and more acquainted to their community, we are pulling back a little bit every day on the support we provide them. Now we can go to the next slide, sorry. When we think about challenges of refugee work, we're resettling a lot of vulnerable people. We prioritize as a country the resettlement of the most vulnerable people in the world, which is it's really often in kind of direct competition, right, with that foundational value that I mentioned earlier of people like getting jobs and getting on their feet right away. The initial resettlement period is 90 days. In reality, we have pretty close contact with most of our clients for about 6 months after they arrive in the country. And for a lot of people, it's more like 8 months or a year or 2 years. And so again, there's kind of this challenge with the resettlement program of trying to get our government partners to really acknowledge that the work looks a lot different from some of the ideologies that drive the program. Of refugees that we've resettled in the last few years, a lot of them are from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Prior to 2017, there were a lot of folks coming from Syria. They have really recent trauma history, which makes them a little bit different from other refugees who have serious trauma, but it may be 5 or 10 years in their past. And particular impacts of sexual and gender-based violence on women and girls, but also on men in populations of refugees from the DRC and Syria. Large families are a challenge. These are also really common in refugees from the DRC and Syria. It's hard to find housing. It's challenging to think through childcare in a two-parent, much less a single parent household where there are 6 or 7 kids that are under, high school age. Single parent households are challenging for the same reason, and along with income. Most low income households really, really benefit from having 2 wage earners. Language is always a challenge. It's one that we're pretty used to, but just because we're sort of well equipped to navigate it within CWS doesn't mean that it's not a challenge for refugees as they make their way around the community. Financial literacy is challenging. A lot of refugees are coming out of situations where they just haven't really had to budget or to think through financial planning. And that's something that someone is sort of scurrying to learn in their first couple of months in the country. And there are pretty dire consequences of not being great at managing your money. The short timeline of resettlement is definitely a challenge. We've done a lot of work over the last few years to expand the services that are available for people after that initial 90 days. But, I think there's always an aspect of everyone could always use a little bit more time to get their feet under them. Long-term upward mobility is a challenge. If you have to work 2 jobs to support your family, you just have really limited time to be in school learning English or, taking a class to become a nursing assistant or something that will pull you out of a hotel housekeeper position and into something that pays a little bit better, provides benefits, and has a little bit more stability. And family separation has been a huge challenge for refugees over the last few years. Like that woman I mentioned, it's incredibly stressful for refugees to live in these long-term ambiguous situations where their spouse or their parents or their children are in another country. It's often a country that's not safe. And there's kind of no end in sight for the stress created by that arrangement. Next slide. So I want to walk through some of the changes of immigration policy under the Trump administration. We can go to the next slide. This is truly a summary. There were so many different changes and iterations of things that it's honestly a little bit hard for me to remember all of the instances. It's mostly the impact that I'll kind of focus on, but if you do have questions, go ahead and ask and I will do my best to remember, which iteration of the travel ban did that or whatever. Over the 4 years of the Trump administration, there were a number of changes to USCIS. I want to back up for a second. One of the things that I'd like to introduce for you before I start reading through these is that many of these changes were policy changes that had sort of appealing sounding names, things like protecting the security of America through enhanced vetting procedures. What they did by and large was insert really, really cumbersome and unnecessary red tape into a system that was already not working all that great, but was kind of working. And really, I mean, Donald Trump ran on an anti-immigrant platform, a largely anti-immigrant platform, and he selected Stephen Miller, who is a very intelligent person, to basically know the immigration system inside and out and come up with changes that would make immigration largely inaccessible for vulnerable and immigrants of color. So as we go through these, I would like for you to keep that in mind because they're not accidental, and they did a lot of damage. There were a number of changes to USCIS's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So basically the entity that's responsible for keeping the immigration system moving. There were a number of staff changes that were basically enacted just to prevent processing of various types of immigration applications. So the idea being, if you can't process them or you can't process them quickly, they will fall into huge backlogs and people won't be able to get into the country. One example of this was creating a backlog in a refugee system that was moving, but moving slowly, by reassigning refugee processing staff to deal with the asylum backlog. There was an asylum backlog. There has always been an asylum backlog in this country, and refugee processing staff are not trained to do asylum processing. The way you address that backlog is by hiring new staff. It's not by robbing Peter to pay Paul. Another example of this kind of change was that this is a recent one, that the administration was planning on furloughing a massive number of USCIS staff who deal with immigration applications because of COVID-19 budget issues. They were forced to abandon that idea when Congress pointed out to them that USCIS's budget is, it's basically a completely separate pot of money from all of the other federal government budgets, and it is determined every year on the fees that immigrants pay to have their immigration applications processed. It's not taxpayer dollars. And so it was basically a sneaky attempt to say, like, oh my gosh, everyone else is having a budget crisis, so USCIS is having one too, so we have to furlough like hundreds of USCIS staff. And they did abandon the idea when it was pointed out that they had plenty of money to pay all those staff and that that money couldn't go anywhere except to pay that staff. But the idea was basically we can make it even more impossible for immigration applications to be processed by laying off all these people. There's a number of different instances. Yes, Stephanie, let me jump to that in 1 second. I think it might become even more relevant in the next couple of slides. Number of instances of the insertion of bureaucratic red tape. So a couple of examples. One is that refugees our government already collects a dramatic amount of biographic information on refugees. There are also highly trained officers in place who are thinking through what sort of information should be absolutely mandatory. And that information is sort of tailored to like the situation that someone is coming from. So for example, if a population of refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo are coming from a very small remote village where there are no like formal addresses, they will require all of the addresses that a person is able to give But there will also be some provisions made for the fact that they, they spent the first 30 years of their life in this village, and they just can't, there is no address, like there's no mailing address. It just doesn't exist for the, the place they were living. So the administration was doing a lot of things, like one of the things they did was insert a requirement that all refugees, no matter where they came from or what their situation was, had to give at least 10 years of formal address history. And if they couldn't provide it, they couldn't be processed. Like their application would just go into a backlog and basically be considered incomplete. Another example is this SAO is security advisory opinion. This is a special type of security check on top of many, many, many other extremely stringent security checks that's required for refugees coming out of certain countries. It's generally countries where terrorist activity is common. So for example, it's required for Syrian and Iraqi refugees, Somali refugees. The SAO checks have traditionally been required for all men and boys over the age of 14. The Trump administration decided that they were going to require them for everyone across the board, not just for those countries, and including like babies. The SAO checks, they involve a number of different government agencies, including Interpol, so they take a long time to complete. And there was a reason that they weren't previously required for certain populations of refugees. It was because those refugees, were already going through tremendously stringent security checks, and the SAO check wasn't considered to be required or even helpful on top of the other checks they were going through. It just creates a backlog and makes it impossible to do the checks on the people where we really should be doing them. There are a number of other examples of bureaucratic red tape, but those are a couple of good ones that had really, really serious impacts on refugees in particular. There were lots of changes to immigration case processing systems. For example, the Trump administration mandated that certain family reunification cases would have to be processed in particular US embassies. We had a case that was the minor children, they're like 10, 12, and 14 years old, of one of our clients who are stuck in a refugee camp in Kenya. And their case was processing out of Kenya, and it was moved to Uganda and mandated that they had to show up for an in-person interview. So, and they weren't the only case that was affected, just to give you like a real person example. The movement of the case to Uganda was completely unnecessary. It was just an effort to create problems and hurdles. And so what was going to be required of these children to get their case processed was that as refugees who have no documentation, they were going to have to sneak across the border into Uganda to go for a mandatory interview. And those kinds of things were happening all over the place. I mean, it wasn't just our case where this was happening. When things finally got up and running in some of these situations where hundreds of cases were moved from one consulate to another, then the administration moved them back. And so it just created these like completely unnecessary, like year to 2 to 3 year delays in actually being able to process these cases. Like it's just a game essentially. And as I mentioned before, most of these moves are targeting vulnerable immigrants or immigrants who are people of color. And I am going to get to that question actually at the end. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of rebuilding the system, and we will talk a little more about the impact of COVID-19 on USCIS staff. And I think it was Stephanie. If I don't fully answer your question, then if you can pipe up and kind of let me know what I didn't get to, that would be great. Next slide. more Trump administration policies affecting vulnerable immigrants. So tons of changes to asylum policy. The sort of most infamous ones being the Remain in Mexico policy. So the US deporting people who had legitimate asylum claims back to Mexico, which is just a violation of international law, essentially. I mean, it's atrocious. Requiring people who were applying for asylum to have a proof that they had been denied asylum in a different country. Many countries can, like proof of denial in Mexico, it can take years to be granted or denied asylum. Most asylum claims sit there processing for several years. And so asking someone who's in danger to prove that they've been denied asylum in a different country before they can even apply or get a credible fear interview in the US is completely contrary to any effort that would be made to like be a safe harbor. And then the most recent and dramatically the most concerning changes were changes to the definition of credible fear. So essentially making the asylum system just inaccessible for people who previously would have had very, very strong cases of asylum. Asylum is, just for anyone who's not familiar, when in the US, a refugee is a person who's been deemed to be a refugee overseas and then like invited to come to the US as a refugee. A person who applies for asylum is a person who arrives here first, and then they make a credible claim to essentially refugee status. And then that claim gets vetted by US citizenship and immigration officials. It's usually a very long process that often has to go through several different court appointments and that kind of thing. And if their story is determined to be credible, then they can remain in the US as an asylee who has most of the same protections as a refugee. But the big difference is that it happens after you come here. And before you are granted asylum, you are not, you don't have a lot of protections under our government. You really have no protections. Family separation in the spring and summer of 2018 is another effect on vulnerable immigrants. This was, as many folks remember, an effort of the Trump administration to deter people from coming to the US. We have no idea how many children are still separated from their parents. It's believed to be in the hundreds, but we really have no idea. And another example of this is terminating temporary protected status for individuals from El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, and Sudan. So temporary protected status is a status that's granted to people who are basically visiting the US in the event that something happens in their home country that makes it unsafe for them to go home, like a military coup or a massive disaster like an earthquake. So there are tens or even hundreds of thousands of folks living in the US with TPS from these countries. And as you can tell by reading the names of those countries, again, these are largely immigrants who are people of color who are being affected by these policies. Go to the next slide. This is damage specific to refugee resettlement. The reduction of the presidential determination. The presidential determination is basically the president consults or is supposed to consult with Congress every year to decide how many people the US as a whole country will resettle. It used to be that the presidential determination was considered to be a goal. The Trump administration made it very clear in their first year that they would consider it to be a limit. In fiscal year 2020, so last year, there was another change made that traditionally the US has said, like, okay, we will resettle like 10,000 refugees from Central America and 30,000 from the continent of Africa and 20,000 from Asia. Those numbers have always been considered to be flexible, but they were numbers put forth that were intentionally constructed with respect to our some of our political and humanitarian interests in different parts of the world, along with, how many people in these different parts of the world actually need to be resettled, or how many refugees are there. In 2020, they did away with the geographic allocations and put forth categories of types of refugees. So there were a couple of changes. One was that the category of type was not considered to be flexible. So like one category was like refugees from Central America, and it was like 1,500 people or something like that. And so basically the idea was, if more than 1,500 people from Central American countries are available to resettle, you still can't resettle that many. But another really impactful piece of this was that refugees were not processed, like they did not apply for refugee status according to these categories. They weren't processed, and the information to determine whether many of these people fell into one of those categories wasn't even available. So it required people who were doing refugee processing to actually conduct new interviews with these refugees, many of whom are in places that are really hard to reach. They don't necessarily have constant electricity or internet, to see if they fit this particular category. So for example, one category was specific to religious persecution. Individuals might include that they had religious persecution as part of their claim, but refugees were not categorized that way in any way, shape, or form. And so people couldn't even be resettled until work had been done to go back and reallocate people into these categories. And finally, the travel bans, at the time that these were put in place, I think over 100,000 refugees who were in the refugee pipeline, so that's the people who are moving through refugee processing, were from Somalia, South Sudan, and Syria. And the travel ban just immediately made them basically ineligible to resettle. There were also pauses on certain steps of refugee processing that were created by the travel bans and some of the ensuing court, cases and questions that created major backlogs. People just sat there while certain security checks and health screenings expired. And then even if they were able to continue moving along, they had to go back and do those steps over. Next slide. This is just a graph of the number of refugees admitted every year. We can go to the next slide, but if you're pulling this up later, good to look at. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of damage done to programs allowing for the reunification of refugee families. And this picture is, so, okay, we're about to build back up and not be so negative. So this is a woman, we helped her apply for her daughter to come through a special refugee program that was available under the Obama administration for refugee youth from Central America. And about a year ago, her daughter's case was actually able to keep moving. It was delayed by about 3 years, but her daughter was able to arrive. And so this is her mom waiting for her at the airport. And if you can go to the next slide, this is them. And on this note, we'll talk a little bit about what has happened in the last couple of weeks and what we expect to happen moving forward. If you can go to the next slide. So immediate changes to immigration policy under the Biden administration, including undocumented immigrants in the census, ending the travel bans, movements to preserve and fortify DACA and create a path to citizenship for Dreamers. They did put forth a 100-day deportation moratorium, although Texas immediately sued, and that the moratorium has been suspended on deportations. But there is going to be a general effort to focus deportation on serious criminals or suspected terrorists rather than just immigrant communities at large, which is a return to like Obama era sort of deportation priorities. And they quickly suspended the Remain in Mexico policy, although there are thousands and thousands of people who were affected by that policy that we haven't quite yet figured out what to do with. I believe there was an article in the news this morning about sort of the first steps to address the folks who are stuck there. You can go to the next slide. The Biden administration also issued an executive order to begin restoring the Central American Minors Refugee Program. That's the program I mentioned a second ago. They'll be looking to address root causes of migration, especially in Central America, create some infrastructure on this continent for people who are fleeing violence in Central America, to actually process them as refugees. And they'll be reviewing the public charge rule and establishing a task force to reunite separated families. We can go to the next slide. They have sort of intentionally decoupled a lot of the broader immigration orders from refugee specific executive orders and policies they're designing. We understand that to be an effort to return to utilizing the U.S. refugee resettlement program as a foreign policy tool, which is a good thing in a lot of ways. You know, one thing that's a consideration for us, and I'll talk about this a little bit moving forward, is just that over the last 4 years, we've made a lot of headway in doing a lot of advocacy work with largely with lots of grassroots groups that represent undocumented immigrants. And we really want to make sure that we don't lose that momentum or sort of abandon our allies, right? When we see that the refugee program has sort of been returned to some, I don't know, special status or special provisions. The refugee EO that was executive order that was signed, so it was a week ago now, set forth plans to set the fiscal year 22, so that's next year, presidential determination at 125,000 people, and nodded to plans to revisit the fiscal year 21 presidential determination, which is currently set at 15,000. Reestablishes the refugee program as a foreign policy tool, prioritizes the reunification of refugee families and resettlement of vulnerable people, revokes a whole bunch of Trump administration policies that were unfriendly to refugees, and orders a full review of their impact to try to get an idea of what needs to be done to actually fix the damage they caused. It looks at delays in the SIV program. This is SIV is Special Immigrant Visa. It's a special program that's reserved at the moment for nationals of Afghanistan and Iraq who have helped the US military in those countries. And the executive order also puts forth a consideration to extend SIV eligibility to folks of other nationalities who have also supported US military interests abroad. You can go to the next slide. It will review security vetting procedures again, including those SAO checks I mentioned earlier, with the goal of making them efficient, meaningful, and fair, so not unduly cumbersome. It will review refugee processing procedures to streamline their efficiency, including adding in video and audio interviews, which haven't been previously available. And they also, I love these other provisions that they put forth in the EO, considering innovation opportunities for refugee resettlement. It's definitely a government program that has suffered from a lack of sort of modernization. And so I appreciate the administration making a nod to the need to, to get into the 21st century. This expansion of private co-sponsorship is a nod to the Canadian model of refugee resettlement. This is just a consideration. It doesn't actually put this provision in place, but I'm glad to see our administration even thinking about it. And the last thing they put in the executive order was a mandate to consider durable solutions for climate-based migrants, and to think of those folks more as more the way we do as refugees rather than sort of like traditional like economic migration. And we can go to the next slide. So what's coming up next? We believe that a new presidential determination for this fiscal year will be signed sometime in the next few days. And we think that it will be for 62,500 people. Basically, it's half a year, and that's half of 125,000 people. There's no way we'll resettle more than 20 to 25,000 people because of processing delays and also some issues related to COVID. So the question earlier about how have USCIS staff been affected by COVID? A lot of folks who are working in overseas capacities, some have been sent home. The bigger issue is actually there are a lot of activities that private organizations like CWS are contracted to provide on behalf of government employees because the work is considered to be too dangerous for US government employees to do. So an example of that is that CWS runs a refugee support center out of Nairobi, where they travel all over Africa to different refugee camps to do various aspects of refugee processing. That's where the real delays from COVID have hit. Those folks are not able to travel. Normally, the government just won't allow their employees to travel to some of these refugee camps. So private nonprofit staff travels instead. But right now, because of COVID, the nonprofit staff cannot travel either. It's not safe, even in situations where there may not be huge COVID outbreaks, or it might be possible to get small groups of staff there individually. There are major concerns about healthcare infrastructure on the continent and in the areas they would be traveling to in the event that they did get sick with COVID. And so we really aren't able to do what we call circuit rides around the country of Africa, or excuse me, continent of Africa. Africa is not a country. If you take one thing away from this, let it be that I misspoke there. So they're making circuit rides around the continent of Africa to different countries and refugee camps that are in those countries, and they're not able to do those right now. We hope that they'll resume in July, but even when they do resume, they'll be resuming on a very small scale because the staff members who make those trips will have to travel in pods, and obviously they'll have to follow, COVID protocols to try to avoid getting sick or spreading COVID. On the flip side, some of the overseas processing that had been stalled for refugees who were impacted by the travel ban or those different categories of refugees has resumed. So even if we're not able to actually get out to refugee camps to interview those people, we can keep working with their paperwork now that we know there's an opening for them to come later. And in terms of kind of local work, we're just rebuilding in an entirely new context. So, excuse me, we have COVID. We have closed a lot of refugee resettlement offices over the last 4 years that weren't able to stay open because of the shrinking of the government programs and government support. We have increased cost of housing, particularly in Durham. Political polarization that we haven't seen before. A big impact of this locally is that, we used to be able to kind of think about resettling refugees, like we would resettle refugees through CWS Durham, but we might set them up with housing in like Hillsborough or Burlington or something like that, especially if they had a family member there. Right now, we are looking at possibly opening a satellite office in Burlington because we have real concerns about the safety of resettling refugees in Burlington if we don't actually have like a community presence there and boots on the ground to deal with some of the, community relationships and political backlash that we might see.
Very diplomatic, Ellen.
Yeah. We also, a big part of our new environment too is that we know how vulnerable the program is now to an anti-immigrant administration. And, we've fully embraced the importance of advocacy as part of our work. But it's not always, it's often an extra lift on top of the actual service to refugees. So figuring out how to fund it and keep the momentum going is really important. And a huge part of the new context is southern border migration. We know that really the majority of people who are crossing our southern borders should be refugees. Like they are, for all intents and purposes, refugees, and just not refugees in name. And we want to make sure that the way we rebuild acknowledges the importance of a humanitarian solution to the wave of people who are coming and seeking protection in this country. I think the next slide is just, you can bounce to the next slide. Just sources. Again, you guys will have all this, but I'd love to go ahead and jump over to questions.
I think you had some in the chat, is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Stephanie, right? Stephanie. Okay. Did I skip some of your question, and how can I better answer it?
Yeah, I have like a very specific question about the diversity visa program. So I know Trump, I forget what year, but he like vowed to end the program. But prior to COVID, it didn't really seem like he did anything other than like making it harder to like access the program. But then with COVID, I think he suspended it. And so I was wondering how that program has been doing now in the Biden administration, and like what the next steps forward are.
Yeah, I can honestly tell you that I know little to nothing about the diversity visa program. I do know that there were lots of efforts made under the Trump administration to reduce the number of visas available through that program, or and also limit them to countries that were likely to mostly have white immigrants, like Sweden. If you will give me 1 second, I do have, I jotted down something actually in a talk I did a couple weeks ago, trying to find it. So the Biden administration is proposing, this is the one tidbit of information I have. The Biden administration is proposing under their US Citizenship Act that they're putting forth, increasing diversity visas from 55,000 to 80,000. But I do not know off the top of my head, like what the number was pre-Trump and what it was changed to under Trump. Great question.
Thank you.
I think there's a Taylor question there as well on the healthcare system.
Yeah, okay, Taylor. The healthcare system in the US is often different from those of other countries. Yes, we do. And yes, there are lots of challenges. And yes, many are related to cultural and religious differences. So we do a lot of work helping people to navigate the healthcare system. Most people can't completely do it independently on their own. It's because, as Taylor, you pointed out, it's just very different. There are so many challenges in healthcare, largely cultural, some religious. The religious ones are also cultural. We do a lot of work to educate local providers on working with refugees. So some of it is educating refugees on their rights under the healthcare system. Like, for example, if you are a Syrian woman and you only want to see female doctors and your doctor unknowingly makes a referral to a male provider, you can ask for a referral to a female provider. You don't have to just go to the male provider because they told you to. So some of it is navigating things like that, not only your rights, but also helping people to actually make like specialist appointments with a provider that they feel comfortable with. Our staff knows a lot about, what things are likely to come up on the front end, and they're sort of developing relationships with different providers constantly to make those services fairly seamless. So like the example I just gave, it's extremely unusual that a Muslim woman would feel comfortable from any country, not just Syria, would feel comfortable going to a male doctor. And so that is something that the case managers who are helping their clients make appointments know and would be able to address up front with them, and are also constantly developing new relationships with providers who would be able to see those folks. Gender is a big one, and then just kind of generally like navigating, it's hard for American, like you go into a doctor's appointment and they hustle you through and it's 15 minutes long. And all of us, I think, have been in the situation of leaving and being like, I had like 10 questions that I kind of forgot to ask while I was in there. And like, now I want to know. And so a lot of what we do too is trying to provide healthcare case management by helping people think through those questions in advance, and often even going to the appointment with them. And like, we don't want to ask the questions for them because ultimately we want them to be able to go to the appointment on their own. But kind of encouraging them to ask the question while we're in the appointment so they can get used to kind of thinking through those things ahead of time. Good question.
Maybe any last question from the room, from here, from inside?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So
I just speak up so she can hear.
from my understanding, the resettlement program emphasizes people who are like employable, but what happens with migrants who either from birth or because of the situation back home are not able-bodied in the same way as those other migrants who would have therefore maybe like difficulties finding employment?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And
Go ahead.
I hate when people do this, but I'm going to start the answer with actually, the US does not prioritize people who are employable at all. The US prioritizes the resettlement of people who are the most vulnerable. So someone who has a disability or a serious health condition would, in the processing of refugee cases, their case would get special attention and would be likely to be expedited. But the foundation of the program is on early self-sufficiency through employment. We do not live out that value through the cases or the individuals that we prioritize for employment. Instead, we have a system that prioritizes people who are the most vulnerable and then kind of lands them here and says, okay, cool, now you're part of the system where you have to get a job yesterday. Resettlement agencies end up being responsible for navigating that tension, right? Like the tension between who is prioritized for resettlement and like, what does the foundation of the program say that, the program does or doesn't do, or like how people are supposed to live out their resettlement once they get here. So we do a lot of work, number one, to connect with employers to try to create jobs for folks who may not be able-bodied and capable of just like running around a hotel doing housekeeping. We also do a lot of work with employers to help them think through ways that, for example, a hotel housekeeping job could maybe be tailored for a refugee who is eager and willing to work, but has some physical disabilities that might make it hard for them. So we had a lot of situations over the last few years where we had a person who was an amputee, missing one or both hands or a leg, who was able to get jobs doing hotel housekeeping because honestly, there were really great managers who were willing to really think outside the box to make an opportunity for someone. It's very difficult in North Carolina for us to resettle refugees who are seriously disabled to the point of not really being employable, unless they are coming with family members or friends who have already agreed to help support them. That's a special type of case. It's either called a U.S. tie case or a cross-reference case, and we will not take a case in my office that doesn't, where I have concerns about their ability to support themselves through both employment and public assistance that's available. There are just other states that do public benefits a little bit better. And when I say a little bit better, I mean like 47 million times better than North Carolina does them. And those states resettle a lot more refugees who are seriously disabled than we do. That's a great question.
We're over time, but does anyone have, if you need to leave, go ahead, but anyone have any other questions online for Ellen? We can maybe keep her for 1 or 2 more minutes. Yeah, go ahead. Is that Maya?
Yeah, I just have a question. I was curious how many people are like on average resettled in the Durham area?
Yeah, so there are 2 resettlement agencies that resettle mostly in Durham. It's CWS and World Relief. Over the last few years, CWS we're a lot bigger than World Relief now. Like we resettle a lot more people, and they've kind of shifted to focus a little bit more on youth services for refugees who already live here. So like pre-Donald Trump, we would resettle about like 350 or 400 refugees a year to Durham. Last year, we resettled less than 100 refugees to Durham between our 2 offices. This year and next year, like COVID will have some impact on this, but say next year, I think we'll probably be back up to like 350 or 400. We will not be able to expand in Durham the way some big metropolitan areas will be able to expand, because I just don't think we have the availability of affordable housing. And so rather than resettling 600 or 700 people in Durham, we'll be looking to outside areas, like I mentioned, Burlington, Mebane, Hillsborough. We're also looking at opening a satellite office in possibly in Wilmington or Winston-Salem. Those are just very nascent ideas. But there is a history of refugee resettlement in those places. And we're curious about exploring opportunities across the state for new communities to welcome more refugees.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Any final questions from the room? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of like from someone on the inside who's like been through this process in regards to like countries in like the EU, like Germany and Ireland, that have had success on the economic side of like assimilating refugees, what does the US do that like inhibits us from like assimilating them properly, especially in terms of like our economy, which is like I feel like a big driver of like why obviously like outside of like racist tendencies, why the Trump administration was like, we can't let these refugees in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different questions there. I would push back on the idea that we don't do a good job of integrating refugees. Most refugees become US citizens within 5 or 6 years of arriving in the country, which is the earliest they can become US citizens. That means that they have enough money to pay for the citizenship application. They have, a good enough command of English to pass the citizenship test, and they have a desire to become a US citizen. It takes a lot of studying and knowledge of US culture and civics to pass the citizenship exam. So, when you talk about assimilation, I would kind of push back on the idea that other countries do it better. Other countries do it very differently, and that is a really valid point to make. And I think that there's a lot of value in exploring like what's good and what's bad. When several years ago, when Germany decided to take a massive influx of refugees from various countries, especially Syria, one of the things that they were looking at was declining population and rapidly aging population, and a kind of a dire need to fill jobs like electricians and plumbers so that the country could keep functioning and be taken care of. And a massive influx of young, healthy refugees who were eager to learn those trades did present a pretty good economic opportunity. Germany resettles refugees very differently from how we do. So I don't know a lot about, the intricacies of the German model, but basically they sort of warehouse people often for several years. And people live in these communities that are only refugees. They're not integrated within the community. So there's like huge apartment buildings that are just full of refugees. And every day they just learn the language and learn like a trade that they've essentially been assigned. And that, on one hand is, it's great. Like if you can create opportunities for people to get to safety through that practice, that's awesome. But it can also be very isolating and very depressing. And, on the one hand, like, yeah, people are learning the language and that's great. But on the other hand, they're not out in the community interacting with the people who actually live there. It's kind of like just a refugee camp within the city with a plan to eventually get out of it. And so when I say, like, I don't know that, other countries necessarily do integration a lot better than we do, but they definitely do it differently. I don't really have any, any data or even anecdotal data on, those refugees and how they're faring, 5 or 10 years out, right? I do know anecdotally that there are a number of stories of refugees finding it extremely like depressing and bad for their mental health to be kind of warehoused in in these situations where they have very little freedom. They're really not able to be like out and about in the community because their day and their journey is like very prescribed. On the flip side, and on our system, for better or worse, like the idea of it is that people have a right to live a life that's not defined by their circumstances. And, that human dignity hinges on giving people the opportunity to practice agency. That isn't necessarily, the same kind of fundamental value of every country's resettlement system. So I think, ideally, like every system has its strengths and drawbacks. And as we sort of rebuild the refugee resettlement system, we should be looking at how other countries do it and ways that their systems might be better, right? Like when I mentioned like the Canadian co-sponsorship system, that is a process that allows private groups of individuals to sign paperwork saying that they will resettle a refugee or a family of refugees, and basically that they will be financially responsible for them for a definite period of time. So the people are admitted to the country as refugees and the Canadian government is screening them, but the Canadian government doesn't have any financial responsibility for them. And so it creates an opportunity for more refugees to be resettled than what the government is able to commit to. And so I think ideally, as we rebuild our own resettlement system, we're innovating, as the Biden administration says we should be doing. And part of that innovation is going to be looking at other countries' systems and what works well, and trying to incorporate them into our own system in ways that we feel like still align with our, our values and kind of our practicalities as a country too. I mean, you only have to look at like immigrant detention centers and kind of the visceral reaction, right, of millions of Americans across the nation to kind of think like, Yeah, it might not be received all that well if we just shoved large groups of immigrants into new warehouses where they had very little freedom of movement and mandated that they had to learn English and that they had to learn, you know, a particular trade, whether their background was as a college professor, a doctor, or, you know, or a housekeeper or a student. That those are sort of very American values that we, you know, ascribe to others. And I think are reasons that system would have to be pretty dramatically adapted to work and get public support here. I don't know if that, I hope that kind of answers your question. It was a really good one.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen, for spending the time with us. I really appreciate it. Wait, can you see me? You may not be able to see me.
Oh, I can't see you yet.
I don't know where I am.
Now I can see you. Hey.
But thank you so much, and I will share the PowerPoint with the students, and we really appreciate you coming in. And
Yeah.
say hi to the doggos for me.
I will. I can't believe they stayed quiet the whole time.
Yeah, right. All right, you take
Bye,
care.
guys. Thanks so much for hanging out. See you later.
Thank you.